For centuries, Gujarat has been described through stories of merchants, farmers, warriors, kings, saints, migrants, and families whose names became famous far beyond the borders of Western India. It is a land that has produced some of the most influential trading communities in South Asian history, one of India's most recognizable business cultures, powerful regional kingdoms, major religious traditions, and coastal cities that once connected the Indian subcontinent to Arabia, Persia, Africa, and the wider Indian Ocean world. Ask a Gujarati family where their ancestors came from, however, and you may receive a completely different answer depending on the community, region, caste, religion, or family tradition. Some will point toward the ancient civilization that flourished across the Indus and western Indian plains. Others will describe ancestors who migrated from Rajasthan or Sindh. Some communities preserve traditions of movement from farther west, while others have lived in the same parts of Gujarat for generations beyond the reach of written genealogy. And for a long time, historians, anthropologists, linguists, and genealogists studied these stories separately. History followed kingdoms and migrations. Archaeology followed settlements and artifacts. Linguistics followed the development of languages. Genealogy followed family lines. But genetics introduced a completely different question. What happens when you stop asking where Gujaratis believe their ancestors came from and instead examine the biological record carried inside their cells? In late 2025 and early 2026, a new study focusing specifically on Gujarat's maternal genetic history provided one of the clearest answers yet. Researchers analyzed 168 complete mitochondrial genomes from Gujarat and compared them with hundreds of additional complete mitochondrial genomes representing South Asian and Eurasian populations. What they found was not a simple story of replacement, invasion, or one ancient population becoming another. Instead, approximately 76% of the maternal lineages in their Gujarat sample were South Asian, around 21% were West Eurasian, and only about 6% were East Eurasian. Even more surprising, the researchers estimated that only about 19% of the West Eurasian maternal lineages appeared to have entered the region during the last 5,000 years, while most of those West Eurasian lineages were older than the major steppe-associated migration into South Asia. The researchers therefore argued that Gujarat retains a largely indigenous maternal genetic foundation, with West Eurasian ancestry arriving through several smaller episodes rather than through one enormous population replacement. And that finding completely changes the question. Because the real genetic origin of the Gujaratis is not the story of one population arriving and replacing another. It is the story of an ancient South Asian population that repeatedly encountered newcomers, absorbed some of them, sent others outward, and over thousands of years became one of the most genetically diverse populations in Western India. This is the real genetic story of the Gujaratis, and it is almost certainly not what you think. To understand why the result is so surprising, you have to go back much further than the moment Gujarat became a recognizable historical region. You have to go back before the Gujarati language, before Hinduism and Jainism had taken their later historical forms, before Islam reached the subcontinent, before the great medieval trading cities of the coast, and even before the Indus Valley civilization itself. Modern humans had been living in South Asia for tens of thousands of years before the first cities appeared. Those early populations were not genetically identical, and they were not frozen in place. They moved across landscapes, separated into regional populations, came back into contact with one another, adapted to different environments, and eventually contributed ancestry to the populations that would emerge much later. Gujarat is especially important in this story because of its geography. The region occupies the western edge of the Indian subcontinent, facing the Arabian Sea, connected northward toward Rajasthan and Sindh, eastward toward central India, and westward across maritime routes toward the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, and East Africa. That position meant Gujarat was never an isolated corner of South Asia. It was a corridor. It was a meeting point. It was a place where people could arrive by land from the northwest, move through the subcontinent from the north and east, or cross the sea from distant parts of the Indian Ocean world. Long before anyone could describe Gujarat as Gujarati, this geography had already begun shaping the population. The first major lesson from genetics is therefore that the Gujarati story begins with deep indigenous South Asian ancestry. The new mitochondrial research is especially important because mitochondrial DNA follows the maternal line, passing from mothers to their children, and the majority of the maternal lineages identified in the Gujarat sample were classified as South Asian. The researchers interpreted this as evidence that Western India retained a substantial maternal population foundation extending deep into the Pleistocene, with little evidence for a massive maternal demographic replacement during the last tens of thousands of years. That does not mean every Gujarati maternal ancestor was born in Gujarat. It does not mean Gujarat was genetically isolated, and it certainly does not mean migration never happened. It means something much more interesting. Migrations happened on top of an already ancient population base. That distinction becomes crucial when we reach the origins of agriculture in the world that eventually produced the Indus Valley civilization. Around 9,000 years ago, farming communities were emerging across parts of the northwestern subcontinent, while populations connected to the Iranian plateau contributed ancestry to the developing genetic landscape. The relationship between these ancient Iranian-related populations and the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations of South Asia was not a simple replacement. Over long periods, ancestry from different source populations became mixed, creating populations that would eventually contribute to the genetic foundation of the Indus Valley civilization. Ancient DNA research has made this picture increasingly clear. The people associated with the Indus civilization were themselves products of earlier mixtures, not representatives of one untouched ancestral population. Their ancestry contained a substantial indigenous South Asian component combined with ancestry related to ancient populations connected to the Iranian plateau. This matters enormously for Gujarat because the region was not merely located near the Indus world, it was part of it. Sites such as Dholavira and Lothal demonstrate that Gujarat was deeply connected to the broader Harappan cultural and economic network. Dholavira, located in the Rann of Kutch, became one of the most remarkable urban settlements of the Indus civilization, while Lothal is famous for its evidence of craft production and maritime trade. These were not communities living at the edge of some foreign civilization. They were part of a much larger interconnected world, extending across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. And this ancient connection provides an important explanation for why Gujarat's genetic story contains strong signals of ancestry related to the populations that formed the Indus civilization. The modern Gujarati population did not emerge from the ruins of the Harappan cities as a completely new population. Instead, descendants of ancient populations associated with this broader civilization remained in the region and became part of later populations. The genetic evidence does not allow us to draw a simple family tree from a specific Harappan individual to a modern Gujarati family, and scientists are careful about making such claims. But it does show that the ancestry associated with ancient South Asian populations survived through later demographic transformations. The newest Gujarat mitochondrial study reinforces this continuity from the maternal side, finding that the majority of sampled maternal lineages belong to South Asian branches, and that most of the West Eurasian lineages present are ancient rather than evidence of one recent replacement event. In other words, when you look beneath the later layers of Gujarati history, the genetic foundation is considerably older than the communities and identities that exist today. But this is where the story becomes more complicated, because the ancient population foundation was only the beginning. Gujarat did not remain genetically unchanged after the Indus Valley civilization. No population does. Over the following thousands of years, people moved through the region from multiple directions. Some movements were large enough to leave substantial genetic signatures. Others were probably small, but persisted because particular lineages expanded over generations. Some migrations involved women, some involved men, and some involved both. This distinction is particularly important because human migration does not affect maternal and paternal ancestry equally. A group of incoming men marrying local women can leave a strong paternal genetic signal while leaving the majority of maternal ancestry indigenous. A migration dominated by families can affect both sides more evenly. A trading community can introduce a limited number of foreign lineages without transforming the wider population. This is why looking at only one type of DNA can sometimes create a misleading picture. The new Gujarat study looked specifically at mitochondrial DNA, and its results show that the maternal side of Gujarati ancestry remained overwhelmingly South Asian despite the region's long history of interaction with populations farther west. Broader genome-wide studies of South Asian populations tell a complementary story. Modern Indian populations generally carry varying proportions of ancestry related to ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers, populations associated with ancient Iranian agriculturalists and later steppe pastoralists, with the exact mixture differing dramatically among regions and communities. Modern Indians, therefore, cannot be placed into a simple binary category of indigenous versus foreign. Their ancestry is layered. Gujarat is one of the clearest places to see why that layered model is necessary. The population contains an ancient South Asian foundation, ancestry connected to the broader Indus-related world, later West Eurasian-related contributions, and additional ancestry introduced through subsequent movements across the subcontinent. The important point is that these layers did not erase one another. They accumulated. And then there is the migration that has dominated so much of the debate about South Asian ancestry. The movement of steppe-related populations during the Bronze Age and later periods. Ancient DNA research has established that steppe-related ancestry entered South Asia and became incorporated into many populations, particularly those speaking Indo-European languages, although the amount differs enormously between communities and regions. This discovery transformed the way scientists understood the spread of Indo-European languages and the formation of many South Asian populations. But Gujarat's new maternal evidence introduces an important complication. The study found that most of the West Eurasian maternal lineages identified in Gujarat predated the steppe migration, meaning that the presence of West Eurasian-related maternal ancestry cannot simply be explained by a single Bronze Age steppe movement. This is a crucial distinction because West Eurasian ancestry is not the same thing as steppe ancestry. Those categories cover populations that separated from one another at different points in prehistory and followed different migration routes. Some West Eurasian-related ancestry reached South Asia thousands of years before the steppe-associated population movements. Much of it was already involved in the formation of populations connected to the Indus civilization. Therefore, when a modern Gujarati genome contains ancestry related to populations west of South Asia, the correct question is not simply, did outsiders arrive? The answer to that is clearly yes, at different points in history. The real question is when they arrived, in what numbers, from which populations, through which routes, and how they interacted with people who were already living there. That is where the Gujarati genetic story becomes much more sophisticated than the old migration narratives. The geography of Gujarat provides an obvious explanation for why such complexity should exist. Look at the map and the pattern becomes almost inevitable. To the north lies Rajasthan, a region that has been connected to Gujarat through trade, migration, warfare, marriage, and pastoral movement for thousands of years. To the northwest lies Sindh, another ancient crossroads connected to the Indus River system. To the east are the populations of central India, while farther south, the genetic landscape gradually transitions toward Maharashtra and the Deccan. To the west lies an ocean that was never really a barrier. It was a highway. Ancient sailors moved along the Arabian Sea long before modern nations existed. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, soldiers, religious communities, and migrants crossed between South Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, and East African coast. Every one of those movements had the potential to leave a genetic trace, but the trace did not have to be large. In population genetics, even relatively small amounts of gene flow can become visible after repeated generations, especially when a particular lineage expands within a community. This is why the Gujarati genetic record contains evidence of both continuity and connection. It is not contradictory. In fact, those two things are exactly what you would expect from a population living at a major crossroads for thousands of years. The newest maternal studies conclusion that West Eurasian lineages entered Gujarat through several small waves, rather than one massive influx, fits remarkably well with the region's historical geography. Gujarat did not need to experience one giant migration to acquire West Eurasian ancestry. It could acquire it repeatedly, gradually, through thousands of years of contact. But there's another surprise hidden inside Gujarati DNA, and it has less to do with ancient migrations than with the way Gujarati society organized itself after those migrations had already occurred. Modern Gujarat is not one genetically uniform population. It is composed of many communities that followed different marriage practices, lived in different environments, and occupied different social and economic positions. Some communities remained relatively open to marriage with neighboring populations. Others practiced strong endogamy, meaning people overwhelmingly married within their own community. Over centuries, endogamy can transform social boundaries into genetic boundaries. This phenomenon is particularly important in South Asia, where caste and community-based marriage systems have often continued for many generations. A study of Gujarati Patels, for example, found evidence that the Chagam Patel community had developed a distinctive genetic profile consistent with long-term endogamy. Consumer genetic research has also identified a genetically distinctive Gujarati Patel cluster and linked part of that distinctiveness to generations of marriage within the community. The implication is enormous. Two people can both be Gujarati, speak Gujarati, share the same broad regional culture, and still have noticeably different ancestry profiles because their ancestors followed different marriage networks for centuries. So when someone asks, what is the DNA of the Gujaratis? The scientifically correct answer is that there is no single Gujarati DNA profile. There is a Gujarati genetic landscape. And that landscape becomes even more fascinating when you move geographically across the state. Gujarat contains Kutch in the northwest, Saurashtra projecting into the Arabian Sea, northern Gujarat bordering Rajasthan, central Gujarat around the major urban and agricultural zones, and southeastern Gujarat transitioning toward the populations of Maharashtra and central India. These regions have experienced different historical interactions. Kutch has long been connected to Sindh and the wider Indus and Arabian Sea world. Saurashtra has been deeply maritime and connected to coastal trade. Northern Gujarat has had strong links with Rajasthan and northwestern India. Southeastern Gujarat has much stronger geographic continuity with central and western India. It would therefore be surprising if all these populations carried exactly the same proportions of ancestry. In fact, the available evidence and community-level genetic data suggest considerable variation. This does not mean that one region is more pure than another. It means that geography leaves a record. The further populations move from one another, the more opportunities exist for local ancestry to become distinct. Add endogamy on top of that, and differences can become even more pronounced. This is why genetic ancestry should never be treated as a ranking system. DNA does not tell you which community is superior, older, more authentic, or more legitimate. It tells you about population history, and population history is rarely a hierarchy. It is a network. One of the clearest examples of Gujarat's unusual position in global human history is found in the African ancestry of the Siddhi communities. Siddhi populations in western India, including Gujarat, preserve substantial ancestry from African populations, reflecting historical movements across the Indian Ocean. Genetic research has shown that the ancestors of many Siddhis were connected to Bantu-speaking populations from sub-Saharan Africa, demonstrating that the Indian Ocean was a major corridor for human movement and not simply a route for spices and luxury goods. This does not mean that Gujarati ancestry is broadly African. It means something more interesting. Gujarat was connected strongly enough to the Indian Ocean world that communities with African ancestry became established there and survived for generations. Their presence is a living genetic record of maritime history. It shows that human migration into Gujarat continued long after the Bronze Age. Ancient populations were followed by medieval populations by early modern populations, and those movements left different traces in different communities. Gujarat's DNA is therefore not a fossil. It is a layered historical document. Some pages are tens of thousands of years old, others are much more recent, and the fact that all of them exist in the same state is what makes the region so scientifically interesting. Religion adds another layer to this story, but here, genetics teaches us to be careful. Gujarat has been home to Hindu, Jain, Muslim, Parsi, and other communities for centuries, and each has its own historical traditions. Yet the ancestry underlying these communities is generally much older than the religions themselves. Genetic ancestry does not suddenly reset when a population changes religion. A community can adopt a new religion while continuing to carry the ancestry of the people who lived in that region generations earlier. Likewise, migration associated with a religious community can introduce new ancestry without completely replacing the population that was already there. This is one reason genetic history should not be used to claim that one modern religious community is foreign and another is native in any simplistic sense. The genetic layers of Gujarat were formed over thousands of years, while many of today's religious identities became prominent much later. The DNA therefore cuts beneath the modern categories. It does not erase them. It simply shows that the people who inhabit those categories today inherited a much older biological history. In that sense, the genetic record is not really telling Gujaratis that their cultural identities are false. It is telling them that those identities were built on top of a much deeper and more complicated population history. The Parsi story provides an especially interesting example because historical tradition records migration from Persia to India following the Islamic conquest of Iran, with Parsi communities eventually becoming deeply associated with Gujarat. Here, the genetic and historical records can be viewed together. A community remembers a migration, maintains a distinct cultural identity, and over generations becomes socially and genetically differentiated through marriage practices. Yet even the story cannot be treated as evidence that Gujarat itself became Persian. It demonstrates something more subtle. Gujarat was capable of receiving migrant communities, allowing them to establish themselves, and preserving their distinct identity while placing them inside a broader South Asian environment. The same principle applies to merchant communities whose historical trade networks connected them with Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and other regions. Cultural influence can travel farther and faster than genes. A merchant can bring a language, a religious tradition, a business practice, or a cuisine without bringing thousands of descendants. A port can become culturally international while the surrounding population remains overwhelmingly descended from older local populations. This distinction between cultural exchange and genetic replacement is one of the most important lessons from Gujarat's history. And this brings us back to the finding that makes the newest research so fascinating. When scientists examined 168 complete mitochondrial genomes from Gujarat, the majority of maternal lineages were South Asian. West Eurasian lineages were present, but they represented a minority. And most of those lineages appeared to be older than the major steppe migration. Only a relatively small fraction appeared to have entered Gujarat within the last 5,000 years. The researchers therefore concluded that Western India retained largely indigenous maternal ancestry, and that West Eurasian maternal lineages arrived through several smaller waves rather than one large demographic event. This means the simplest version of the story is wrong. Gujarat was neither an untouched genetic island nor population completely transformed by outsiders. It was something in between. an ancient South Asian population repeatedly connected to the wider world. That is a much more interesting story because it explains both sides of the evidence. It explains why Gujarat contains deep indigenous ancestry, and it explains why the region also contains genetic connections extending westward. The apparent contradiction disappears when you stop imagining population history as a series of replacements and start thinking of it as layers. There is also a practical reason why this research matters today. Gujarat has a huge amount of genetic diversity, but historically many South Asian populations have been underrepresented in global genetic datasets. A large proportion of modern medical genetics has been developed from populations of European ancestry, which means genetic risk predictions and disease associations do not always transfer perfectly to populations with different histories. Gujarat's growing genetic research can therefore contribute not only to archaeology and anthropology, but also to medicine. In 2025, Gujarat announced a major genome mapping initiative focused specifically on tribal populations across 17 districts, with plans for thousands of biological samples and roughly 2,000 whole genome sequences representing more than 20 tribal communities. The project includes communities such as Pil, Rathwa, Gamit, Worli, Tadvi, Valvi, Sidi, and others, and is intended to improve understanding of genetic diversity and population-specific health patterns. That project is important because the story we currently have is still incomplete. The 2026 mitochondrial study dramatically improves our understanding of Gujarati maternal ancestry, but mitochondrial DNA represents only one narrow line of inheritance. It is not the same as sequencing the entire genome of every Gujarati community. The authors themselves emphasize that their work provides a maternal perspective, rather than a complete reconstruction of every component of Gujarati ancestry. This distinction matters because responsible genetic history does not turn one dataset into an absolute answer. The more scientists sample different communities, regions, and family networks, the more detailed the picture will become. So what does the evidence actually tell us about the real genetic origin of the Gujaratis? It tells us that there probably was never one single Gujarati ancestor. There was no moment when a population suddenly arrived and became Gujarati overnight. Instead, the modern Gujarati population emerged from an ancient South Asian foundation that existed long before the Gujarati identity itself. That foundation interacted with populations connected to ancient Iran and the wider West Eurasian world. The people of the Indus Valley cultural sphere became part of the ancestry of later Western Indian populations. Later, steppe-related ancestry entered South Asia and became incorporated into some communities more strongly than others. Populations moved between Gujarat, Rajasthan, Sindh, Central India, the Deccan, and the wider Indian Ocean world. Merchant networks brought foreign connections. Maritime migrations brought African ancestry into particular communities. Religious migrations brought new populations and cultural traditions. And then, over centuries, communities increasingly married within themselves, preserving and concentrating some of these ancestral patterns. The result was not one bloodline, it was a mosaic. And perhaps the most important part of that mosaic is what the new maternal research tells us about the women who carried Gujarati ancestry through time. The fact that roughly 76% of the sampled maternal lineages were South Asian means that the maternal history of Gujarat preserves a remarkably deep local signal despite thousands of years of interaction with populations from beyond the region. That does not mean every woman in ancient Gujarat was genetically identical, and it does not mean all modern Gujarati women descend from one ancient maternal population. It means that the maternal lineages that survived into the sampled modern population overwhelmingly belong to branches rooted in South Asia. The West Eurasian lineages are real, but they form a minority and appear to have entered through multiple periods rather than one massive recent replacement. This is the opposite of a simplistic invasion narrative. It is continuity with contact. And there is a deeper lesson here that goes beyond Gujarat. Human populations almost never fit the stories they tell about themselves perfectly. Communities create origin stories because humans need narratives. We want to know where we came from. We want a beginning. We want a founding ancestor, a homeland, a migration, a heroic journey. But DNA rarely gives us one clean beginning. It gives us branches. It gives us mixtures. It gives us populations that separated and reunited. It gives us migrations that involved only a few people, but had enormous consequences generations later. It gives us communities that were culturally transformed without being genetically replaced. And it gives us ancient ancestry that survived beneath identities that did not yet exist when those ancestors were alive. Gujarat is a perfect example of this broader human pattern. Its modern identity is real. Its language is real. Its religious traditions are real. Its merchant culture is real. Its regional history is real. But the genetic foundation beneath all of them is older and more complicated than any single origin story can capture. That is why the phrase, The real genetic origin of the Gujaratis needs to be understood carefully. The real origin is not one place. It is not one migration. It is not one caste. It is not one religion. It is not one ancient kingdom. It is a process. It is thousands of years of people meeting other people, having children, moving again, separating into communities, trading across oceans, marrying within families, and gradually becoming the populations we recognize today. The genetic evidence does not tell Gujaratis that their ancestors were simply outsiders or simply untouched natives. It tells them something more remarkable. They were both deeply rooted in South Asia and connected to a much wider world. Their ancestry carries the memory of ancient South Asian populations, the legacy of the Indus world, ancient West Eurasian connections, later Eurasian migrations, and much more recent movements across the Indian Ocean. These layers did not cancel one another. They accumulated. So if scientists had to summarize the Gujarati genetic story in one sentence, it would not be that Gujarat was founded by one ancient person. It would be that Gujarat became what it is through continuity and connection. The majority of maternal ancestry in the newest study remains deeply rooted in South Asia, while smaller West Eurasian contributions reveal that the region was never isolated from the populations to its west. The surprising part is not that Gujarat contains foreign ancestry. Given its geography, that would be expected. The surprising part is how strongly the ancient South Asian maternal foundation survived, despite thousands of years of migration and contact. And perhaps that is the most fascinating discovery of all. Gujarat was never a genetic island. It was never a blank space waiting for outsiders to arrive and create a population. It was an ancient population crossroads that repeatedly absorbed new people without losing the deeper ancestry already present. The ports changed. The kingdoms changed. Languages evolved. Religions spread. Trade routes shifted, empires rose and disappeared, families moved across borders that did not yet exist. Yet underneath all those transformations, ancient maternal lineages continued to pass from mother to daughter, from one generation to the next, carrying fragments of a history that began tens of thousands of years before anyone called themselves Gujarati. The DNA, therefore, does not reveal a simple origin. It reveals something much more human, a population built layer by layer, generation after generation, through both continuity and change. The Gujaratis of today are not the descendants of one ancient migration. They are the descendants of many histories that eventually became one regional identity. And that is why the real genetic origin of Gujarat is not a single bloodline written in the past. It is a living genetic mosaic, ancient South Asian at its foundation, repeatedly connected to the wider Eurasian and Indian Ocean worlds, and still evolving as the descendants of all those ancient populations carry the story forward.